Hello and good evening. Well, good evening if you're watching from the UK, I should say. If not, good day to you. My name is Madeline Hennigan. I'm one of the co-directors of Writing on the Wall, and I'm here to welcome you to Black History Month at WoW. Right now, in the face of the mobilization of the far right, particularly in the US, and increasing racist attacks, including here in Liverpool, and with Black communities being hit hardest by the current pandemic, Black History Month could not be more relevant or more important. So here at WoW, we're midway through, and we've had two fantastic weeks. Weeks of important discussions on such questions as what next for the Black Lives Matter movement, and looking at how we decolonize our learning. And it's also been packed with fantastic writers, artists, and commentators. And there's so much more to come. But my co-director, Mike, will tell you about what's to come at the end of this event. This evening, in what we feel is a real coup, we are proud to welcome two incredible writers. Marlon James, all the way from New York, and your host for this evening, Irenosen Okojie. Marlon, of course, is a writer with a string of accolades and awards under his belt, including the Booker Prize, which he was awarded in 2015 for a brief history of 7 killings. And I have to say that that book contains some of the most powerful pieces of writing that I've ever read. This evening, Marlon will be talking about his latest novel, Black Leopard, Red Wolf, which is the first book within the Dark Star trilogy. It's been described as a game-changing modern fantasy classic. And tonight, Marlon is in conversation with Irenosen Okojie, also an award-winning writer. This year, only in July, actually, she was awarded the AKO Kane Prize for Fiction for her stunning story, Grace Jones. And her debut novel, Butterfly Fish, won a Betty Trash Award. Her short story collection, Speak Gargantula, was met with huge critical acclaim and has a string of award nominations. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to Irenosen, a newcomer to WoW. So I'd like you to join me in giving her a very warm and virtual welcome to Writing on the Wall. Welcome, Irenosen.
Thank you so much, Madeline. I'm delighted to be here introducing one of the greatest writers, modern writers around. Actually, it's a real privilege to welcome Marlon James to the festival as part of Wowie's Festival Black History Month celebrations. I'll be talking to Marlon about his latest novel, Black Leopard, Red Wolf, which is the first in the Black Star trilogy. He'll do some readings, there'll be a conversation, and then hopefully some time for the audience to pose their questions as well. And that should take us up to the hour. But without further ado, I want to introduce the man of the moment again, Marlon James. Marlon James was born in Jamaica, 1970. He was the first Jamaican to win the Booker Prize for his best-selling novel, A Brief History of 7 Killings. The novel also won the Anisfield Wolf Book Award and the Minnesota Book Award, and has been translated into 21 languages. Marlon James is also the author of 2 other novels, John Crow's Devil and The Book of Night Women. Black Leopard, Red Wolf is the first installment in his Dark Star trilogy. Marlon, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. It's
well,
Sorry?
I have to say, congratulations on the novel. It's extraordinary. I was reading it and just blown away by the sheer scope of it, really. And what it does with form and language is really, really striking. So I wondered if you could kick things off for us by giving us a reading.
I'm sure. Let me read a pretty short section. A lot of the stories in the novel are characters telling stories. So this is a character. This is a character tracker, and he's actually telling a story within the story. It says there was a merchant in the Purple City who said he lost his wife. She went missing with 5 gold rings, 10 and 2 earrings, 20 and 2 bracelets, and 10 and 9 anklets. It is said you have a nose for finding what would rather stay lost, he said. I was near 20 years and long banished from my father's house. The man thought I was some kind of hound, but I said yes, it has been said that I have a nose. He threw me his wife's undergarment. Her trail was so faint it was almost dead. Maybe she knew that one day men would come hunting, for she had a hut in 3 villages, and no one could tell which one she lived in. In each hut was a girl who looked exactly like her and even answered to her name. The girl in the third house invited me in and pointed to a stool for me to sit. She asked if I was thirsty and reached for a jug of masuku beer before I said yes. Let me remind you that my eyes are ordinary, but it has been said that I have a nose. So when she brought over the mug of beer, I had already smelled the poison she put in it, a wife's poison called cobra spit that loses taste once you mix it with water. She gave me the mug and I took it, grabbed her hand and bent it behind her back. I put the mug to her lips and forced it between her teeth. Her tears ran down and I took away the mug. She took me to her mistress who lived in a hut by the river. My husband beat me so hard, the mistress said. I have 5 gold rings, 10 and 2 earrings, 20 and 2 bracelets, and 10 and 9 anklets, which I will give you, as well as a night in my bed. I took 4 anklets and I took her back to her husband because I wanted his money more than her jewelry. Then I told her, have the woman from the third hut make him masuku bear. And that is it.
Thank you. That was so potent and compelling. What strikes me about the writing is it's really vivid but very sinewy. It's a really controlled writing, even though it paints a really a kind of potent picture of this ancient Africa that you bring us, the reader, into. And the story follows Tracker, who you mentioned, who is a gifted mercenary on the hunt for this young boy, this mysterious young boy, through ancient Africa, across different regions. But of course, there's a whole multitude of eclectic characters in this, and there are other mercenaries, there are interesting bands of characters, there are shifts in tone, dimensions, and rhythms, and what you do with language is so electric. I found it quite an addictive book reading it. I was going to say that it's been referred to as the African Game of Thrones, which
Right.
I think is a fair comment, but I also think it occupies its own very unique space. So I wanted to ask you about that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that really came about because I couldn't keep my mouth shut. It's funny because I know George, and George also emailed me and said, I heard you write an African version of my book. It's like, I said that out, not totally tongue in cheek. I said it to a magazine that I thought nobody read. Turns out everybody who reads it works in media. So, but I meant it though in the sense that the thing I love about Game of Thrones, and the thing I love about when you go back to real old folklore and actually real old fairy tales, is the idea that growing up and letting go of make-believe are not two isolated things. And I think we have this idea that once we put imagination behind, once we let go of monsters and fairies, once we stop believing that thing is under the bed, we've grown up. And that fiction that reflects a social realism is fiction that has grown up. I read a lot of social realist novels and I never see Black people in them.
Right.
That's as crazy as Superman. The idea that there is this, just the idea of that, these things that have fired our imagination, that are set, that create the myths that continue to define us, is something we should let go just because we're adults. Was something that Game of Thrones helped me get rid of, because I wanted a novel that was a very much a serious, for want of a better word, adult novel, but I didn't want to let go of monsters.
Brilliant. I love that you say that. I love that you say that, you know, we don't have to give up the idea of monsters and mythology and folklore once we grow up, because that's all part of storytelling. And it's really interesting tool, I think, to reflect what's going on in the world. So I wondered if you could talk specifically about the ideas behind this novel. I'd be really interested to hear that and what your intention was. And B, also, you know, this foray into fantasy, because having written 3 previous novels, you know, John Crow's Devil, The Book of Night Women, of course, A Brief History of 7 Killings, which I think a lot of people would consider literary fiction, that this was kind of an unexpected move for you. But I think it's genius. It's like really inspired, because actually fantasy writing really lends itself to the strengths of your writing. So if you could talk about both the ideas and moving into fantasy.
Well, to me, it didn't seem as big a move to me, mostly because there are fantastical elements in all my stories. Even Brief History, which technically is a crime novel, you know, it's anchored by a ghost, and the only character with full perspective in that novel is a ghost, and you know, and that was very important to me, and that has always translated to me as, you know, I really take it to heart, you know, something, you know, Gabriel Garcia Marquez said, you know, about the Caribbean, but I think it applies to anywhere, that the truth of it is wilder than any fiction. And I certainly wanted to stick to that. But also, you know, this novel, maybe the first novel that didn't begin as a novel. And I don't mean it began as a short story. I mean, I didn't start reading about this to write a book. Right. I started reading this because I got into a fight with somebody over the Hobbit film when they announced the cast. And I was like, oh Lord, here we go again. Another totally white cast. And we're going to have to talk about representation, and we're going to talk about diversity, and it's going to lead to an argument, which is exactly what it led to. And, you know, and I was saying, you know, I think it was 2010. I was like, come on, 2010, we're still having this type of casting, blah, blah, blah. And, you know, I said, you know, if we went into the Shire and there was an Asian hobbit, nobody would have cared. And he went on that it was about British mythology and British history, and it's tied into these legends, and Lord of the Rings is into that. I said, you know, Lord of the Rings isn't real. You know, it's funny because I gave the Tolkien lecture 2 years ago, I think. And one of the things I spoke to about J.R.R. Tolkien, who I'm a huge hero of, but Tolkien could move in a universe where he could take his myths for granted. When you grew up in certain parts of the diaspora, not all of them, but certainly the way I grew up with a British colonial education. So, you know, whether British people know it or not, you know, they live under the permission of King Arthur. They may not know it, but the very idea of Britain as a nation of the civilized, Britain as a court of Camelot, Britain as this place of courtly love and chivalry is because of the myth of King Arthur, which is essential to Britishness, because nobody wants to know that that early Britons lived in the most destitute, most deprived, most backward conditions in all of Europe. The Romans came, you know, Romans showed up, they were appalled. But what I'm getting to is that mythology, which I don't think the average British person thinks about, is still crucial to the idea of civilized Britain. Now, take it where I grew up, where for me, ground zero is Christopher Columbus discovered Jamaica, or ground zero is let's talk about slavery. That part, my African gods, my African folklore, such and such, all these things, I didn't get the chance for those myths and legends and religions to do to me what, say, a King Arthur or so on did to somebody in the UK. So that's really the first reason why I went back to these stories after getting that fact, was I wanted that. I wanted those mythologies, I want those legends, I want those religions, I want to take something else as real. And it's when I was doing it that I started to think, man, this book is writing itself. Because even even when I had an idea for what this book was, it was still tied to a very European idea of fantasy. And if we're going to have to talk, if we're going to talk about fantasy, we have to talk about Europe, and we have to talk about most of the fantasy template for the most part is still very European.
Well, let's
Most
talk
fantasy
about that.
novels, yeah.
Let's talk about that, because of what you've done here is counter that really beautifully, because you've set it in this ancient Africa that in some ways feels recognizable, but in some ways feels very new to me, which was really, really exciting. And I love that you're doing that. It's actively disruptive because, of course, there is ancient African mythology. Of course, there are like folkloric stories and histories that are often hidden and that we don't really get to know about. But what you've done is you've taken all of that quite beautifully and imbibe the essence of that within this book. So I wondered if you could talk about that, this myth making and how you've done that, because I'm just going to read this quickly. I mean, there is so much in this book. There are 13 kingdoms, multiple regions, mercenaries, a host of creatures including alchemists, vampires, anti-witches, cannibals, and more. It's astonishing, the scope of it. So talk about the process of myth building and world building, please.
Yeah, I think a lot of people think the secret to myth building and world building in that sense was just to add a lot of stuff. And that's totally true. But I could have very easily have written a European novel with brown people. Lots of fantasy stories out there say they have people of color, but when you read it, it's still St. George slaying the dragon. And and I didn't want that. I didn't want a European fantasy in brownface or a European fantasy in blackface. So it's not just a matter of finding African vampires. It's also finding the thinking, the belief, and all of that behind it. For example, when I in the West say midnight, there's a whole series of connotations we put to that word, all of them European. Scary, the witching hour, evil, dark. That's when the spirits come out, but the spirits don't mean any harm. That's when you should have been in bed. That's all. And I'm not knocking it because I grew up in it and I still love it. But I started to research stuff in the Sahel, and I came across this: midnight is the noon of the dead. Now, even when I say that, we're still thinking, oh, zombies, monsters. That's not what it means at all. It means that is a time when your ancestors are most come out and ready to see you. If I know midnight is when I get to hang out with my really cool aunt, who I can tell anything that I can't tell my mother, that is a joyous occasion.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now switch it to high noon in the day, which we think is broad daylight. A lot of these vampires I was tracing, that's when they attack. So because they're not scared of the dark, and they're not scared of daylight burning them to death. It's like, no, I will come kill you in broad daylight. It's just that alone is an example of the type of shifting I had to do before I started doing this world building and building these creatures and these fairies and these monsters. It's not just creating a monster, it's also going back and looking at the sensibility behind them. So it doesn't just seem as if I added a coat of brown paint on a white monster.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the thinking behind it. It's the intention as well. And I guess an essence of that history is really important to imbue the writing with. I love that you talk about the witching hour being a time to hang out with relatives, and spending time with cool relatives and possibly like having a chinwag with your aunt. I want to digress for a moment and just go back to a brief history of Seven Killings and the absolutely huge cultural impact that novel had, winning the Man Booker, sales going through the roof, becoming, being catapulted into a completely different level of fame. And all of that has an impact on a writer's mentality, I think, definitely. I'm curious about what that impact was on you as a person. I'm blown away that you were able to write this next book, considering all of that happened, because a lot of people might need to just go away and be, you know, quiet for several years before they work on the next book. But you have managed to produce something else. I mean, your writing is so prolific. It seemed that it didn't stop you in your stride at all. So I wonder if you could talk about how that affected you and how it affected the writing of this book, if it did in any way.
Yeah, I know it's looking like I'm being distracted by something. I'm actually not. I was trying to find the picture of the day I got a copy of Brief History. I can't find it. But the copy that I have, the photo of it, my first copy of Brief History, in the photo, the book is on top of a huge encyclopedia of African ceremonies.
Wow.
Which point is, I was thinking about this novel from before Brief History even came out. You know, because I didn't want, and I usually do that. Usually, I'm rarely in the headspace when I'm promoting a book. I'm rarely in that book's headspace because I'm already on to the next one. It kind of keeps me grounded. It did change. It changed everything. It changed. I mean, at one point, it seemed anything I said on Facebook became a scandal. It was interesting. I remember a little after the Booker, I talked about my friend Clairvere Watkins wrote a brilliant essay about pandering and about how, as a white woman writer, she still feels she has to pander to men. She still feels that, why am I measuring my book against Moby Dick? You know, as opposed to Pale Horse Pale, you know, as opposed to as opposed to even Pride and Prejudice or Beloved. And I remember saying, yeah, but you know, a lot of writers of color feel they have to pander to this archetype of the white woman. And that exploded. I mean, people were just exploding all over the place about it. Most people misinterpreted what I said, which is basically that, you know, publishing still has these narrow ideas about reader expectations. But that's just an example of how things changed after, and most of it wasn't like that. A lot of it was really, really incredible. I think, you know, one of the reasons why it struck a chord is, you know, all of us grew up in a sort of post-colonial fiction, and I grew up with it as well. But one of the things that I was trying to do is the same thing I think Juna Diaz was trying to do with Brief Wonders of Oscar Wilde, which is, what happens to the children of these post-colonials? What happened to people who my uncle Errol was literally on the Windrush. He actually came over on that actual boat, on that actual ship. What about the generation after that and the one after that? And how do we come to terms with what the 70s and the 80s was? And I think that struck a chord with a lot of people. I also really wanted a book that sounded like the characters in the novel. And I think one of the things I found, and I think one of the reasons why this book was successful, is that readers could take ownership of it. You know, if it's anything from people speaking the way Jamaicans speak to the fact that a huge part of the book, a bunch of characters are listening to an Andy Gibb song.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that you know, in a way, sort of created those sort of entry points. But it did change. It changed a lot. Also, I mean, you know, hey, let's keep it real. Selling a book sure beats not selling a book.
Absolutely, it's better than being in the difficult position of not being able to shift copies. But no, it's fascinating that, of course, it changed your life like dramatically, but also that you are really keen to, I guess, interrogate cultural inheritance. And what that looks like, you know, and how that manifests in the work is really interesting as well. I think this is a good point for you to give us a second reading from the new novel. That would be wonderful.
Let's see. Did I lose what I was gonna read? Thank God I have all these sections marked out. I know what I want to read if I could find it. Let's see. Maybe ask me a question while I look for it.
And novel is such an expansive read.
No, I can't even find what I'm looking for. Ah, here we go.
Have you found it? Okay, perfect. You can. I'll ask you afterwards.
Yeah. Oh, hold on. I think I lost. No, Wait, I lost it. Maybe you should ask me. Where did I do it? It's such a dense book here,
Okay, let me ask you the question, and then hopefully you can locate it. So I was going to say, like, the novel it's so expansive. It's so like huge in scope. I wondered what your approach to form for this was. I can't imagine it being anything else other than a novel, because there's so much to tell in this story. But I was curious, was there another iteration of it where it was, I don't know, maybe stories or
my books always have different iterations. I think different novels. Like Brief History started that way as well, where it was a totally different kind of novel. And with this one, I think the thing about this novel for me, it took me a long time to figure out who's telling the story. Right. And I realized sometimes with me that I will almost road test a novel. Like I come across my students sometimes and they're afraid that they write 10 pages and not use. I'm like, I've written 550 pages and not used it. And all these, no page one in my novel is ever the page one in this book. I remember this book particularly, I wrote 55 pages. I remember the number because when I finished it, I was so happy because I know that wasn't the book. And man, I wish I could come up with a smarter way of knowing how to write. But the only way I know is still to fumble along until something works. And I keep trying. I got, that didn't work. No, right. This is it.
I think that's the way for most writers, isn't it? Yeah. It's to kind of, you go by instinct, you know, it's a process of investigation for you. You're sort of feeling your way through the dark, really, trying it out, testing out different perspectives, until something really strikes and resonates. And then you just know when you know, don't you? You kind of instinctively figure out that this feels right for this novel, or, you know, it feels right to tell it from this perspective. And I'm not sure that ever changes.
I think I've gotten a little better at it. I think, you know, it's easy to say because I'm writing a sequel. It's kind of, the book is almost kind of preordained. But only loosely so. But yeah, it's the scale of this didn't. I mean, I knew I wanted to write. I knew I wanted to write a big book, not necessarily because I wanted to write a big book, but because that's my favorite kind of fantasy. I like not fantasy novels that I'm going to spend a really long time in. I'm totally geek out on. And I know I wanted to write. I wanted to write a book like that. I wanted to write something that I still believe what Toni Morrison says, write the books you want to read.
Absolutely.
And I think this is funny because usually journey novels for me are pretty simple and they stay simple, but this got really complicated because, again, so many of what I was leaving behind, even like the idea of this sort of clear journey to destination thing, which again to me strikes me as such a Eurocentric way of telling a story. African stories, Indian stories don't move like that. You know, stories end up on stories, and stories retell stories, and you can't totally trust who's telling a certain story.
Yeah, and it changes as well. It changes depending who's telling the story. It mutates, you know.
You know, I mean, the last section of this story, of this novel, Tracker is in such a different sort of mental state, and such a different sort of person than when he was in the rest of the book, making allegiances with people he wouldn't have been caught dead making allegiances with 400 pages ago. But I realized it was that kind of novel. Another thing about fantasy that I know could never work for a novel that's based on African history and mythology is evil is clearly evil and good is clearly good, and the night is the night. You know, none of my characters are like that. And you know, the world of these stories, it's too complicated, it's too ambivalent, it's too sensory, it's too sensual, it's too, that's why there's so many shapeshifters.
Yeah, and I love that in it. I I love what you've done here because it gives us this ancient Africa that's, I find it really inspiring that you've been able to tap into African mythologies and create this very unique novel. I think it's hugely inspiring. You've done something new with the form as well, incorporating folklore, you know, fantasy. It's fantastical as well.
Lots of comics too.
It's phantasmagoric. I mean, it's audacious. I mean, it's just huge what you've done. So I wondered if you could talk about that, how you've managed to create this very potent space. You know, because space is important to anchor a novel, and you made a very deliberate decision to set it in pre-colonial Africa, which is wonderful. So, like, talk about that a little bit before you give us your reading.
Yeah, I wanted pre-colonial, but also pre-colonial, but also pre-Islam Africa. Even though there are lots of Islamic Africa I took, including the huge, you know, the writing tradition and the libraries and so on. Yeah, it's. I'm trying to, you know, how it came about is because part of it too was also, you know, I was writing a character, most, you know, that's not usually the type of character you see long novels about. I started out like any other European fantasy about it being the fall of a royal house, and it just didn't work. And I remember I had this sort of book with ideas, sort of, and I remember holding it like this, and it's when, what if I did this?
Just flipped it.
Just turned it upside down.
Right.
And then all the people in the street went up to the top, and all the people in the throne room went to the bottom, and you know, the novel came about, you know, that way. But also, you know, I was ambitious. I did want to write something big, and I did want to write something that is based on all the things I've been learning. And you know, it's funny. It's I mean, in some ways, I think even based on African mythology is limiting, because most of the stuff I read was focused on just the Sahel region. So, but I haven't even gotten to South African mythology yet.
Right. So you were just one region alone kind of threw up so much. That's incredible.
Yeah, because there's just so much. The struggle rather was to resist it all and resist so much and so on. And but I knew that I wanted a kind of a world that people can be lost in. And sometimes some readers let me, they got a little lost, and I'm like, oh, thank you.
That's what I wanted. I wanted to create a really immersive read for you. That's absolutely brilliant. I think now might be a good time to do the next reading if you found it.
So this is Tracker again, where Tracker is looking for someone, and he gets caught into a festival called Bingungun. So it's really just about the festival. So it says, Bingungun. This is what I learned from the Kongori and why they hate nakedness. To wear only skin is to wear the mind of a child, the mind of the mad, or even the mind of the man with no role in society, even lower than usurers and trinket sellers, for even such as they have their use. Bingungun is how people of the north set a place for the dead among the living. Bingungun is the masquerade, drummers and dancers and singers of great Oriki. They wear the asawake cloth underneath, and this cloth is white with indigo stripes and looks like that which we clothe the dead. They wear net on the face and hands, for now there will be masquerade, not men with names. When the Bingungun spins and makes a whirlwind, the ancestors possess them. They jump as high as roofs. He who makes the costume is an Amewa, a knower of beauty. For if you know the Kongori, they view everything through the eyes of what is beautiful. Not ugly, for that has no value, especially ugliness of character. And not too beautiful, for that is a skeleton in disguise. Bingungun is made from the best of fabrics, red and pink and gold and blue and silver, all trimmed in cowries and coins, for there is power in the beauty. In patterns, braids, sequins, tassels, and amulets with medicine. Bin Gingun in dance, Bin Gingun in march, make for transformation into the ancestors. All of this I learned on my travels, for Juba has masquerade, but they are not Bin Gingun.
Thank you, Marlon. That was wonderful. That was really again such striking use of language, and yeah, there's a real momentum with the writing. There's a real pace to it, like, you know, that just sort of pulls you along, that I really love. So thank you for that. We've seen in the current landscape, you know, current social political landscape, with Black Lives Matter happening and that becoming a global issue, that Black narratives have now come to the fore. So we have writers like Jason Reynolds, who has a new graphic novel out called The Long Way Down. N.K. Jemisin, of course, has been writing brilliant genre-busting work for a while now. Namwali Sapau just won the Arthur C. Clarke Award for her novel The Old Drift, which is a science fiction award. So it's brilliant. Yeah, it's brilliant to see Black writers, you know, kind of writing across different genres. So I wondered if you could talk about the importance of that. You know, we have you writing fantasy and these guys also stepping out of the box. I wonder if you could talk about the importance of Black writers doing that, because I think that's really exciting, that we're now sort of stepping out of certain expectations. So yeah, I'd love it if you could comment on that.
Yeah, I think to an extent we've always been stepping out of those expectations. You know, Toni Morrison's Song of Solomon to me is a magical realism novel. Ishmael Reed did things like Flight to Canada and so on. I think, you know, Black writers have always been doing this. I think sometimes it's the publishing world's narrow expectations of what Black writers can and supposed to do that made it seem any other way. You know, that said, there are you know, generation of us, and I mean I'm definitely not young, but we grew up in a way where we took so many things for granted and we didn't rank it. I don't think I didn't rank in a field of say Spider-Man, Star Wars, and Romeo and Juliet. I didn't rank them. But I also think these, you know, these times that we're in are so crazy and so violent and so dangerous and so unpredictable, that it doesn't surprise me that so many of us are reaching to the fantastical to try to understand it.
Right.
In a lot of ways, we're just going back to our mythologies, because our mythologies is what tell us who we are. So it doesn't surprise me. I remember thinking about this and talking about it with some writers a few years back, particularly, who was I talking to? Victor Laval, who wrote The Changeling, another one of those novels. And we talked about it. You notice all of us are going back into this fantastical, magical thing. What do you think's going on?
Yeah.
And I think in some ways, it's kind of how Black people from descended from Africa have always processed the world. When we're dealing with those things, you know, you invoke the spirits, or you bring down the gods, or you write beyond, you know, this sort of what we think the world is. Because I think we come to a better understanding of what's going on.
Yeah. And absolutely, it gives us, I think, it gives us more space and I guess more tools to make sense of our experiences, and it doesn't feel so limited in a way, because what you can do is translate it through that process of fiction in ways that are really interesting and exciting.
Yeah, because I don't know if you have to come across a Black writer or any Black creative who grew up in a world where they were told only one thing was art, and only one thing was telling a story, and only one genre mattered. I didn't grow up that way, and I don't know if anybody else who did. And I think, you know, in this time we're looking at different ways of telling a story, and the fantastical way has always been, you know, it's always been there. That's why we still have, you know, in African American stories, that's the myth of the person who could fly,
right?
For example, you know, and I think, yeah, you know, I mean, thinking about this cultural moment, you know, I live in Minneapolis, I live on Lake Street, which is basically 30th Street in Chicago. George Floyd was killed on 38th in Chicago. So George Floyd was killed 7 blocks from my house.
That's crazy.
So, you know, the reality of the world that we people of color, we Black people are living in is never far away. To me, I don't think we're even escaping reality by writing these things. I think that's what we deal with it.
Right,
honestly.
right.
And I
It's a
think
way of
more and
coping.
more of us have been seeing ourselves drawing towards that kind of telling stories in that kind of way.
Yeah, I'm really excited about it. You mentioned actually one or two of my favorites. Ishmael Reed is incredible. I love his work. He seems to be a writer that not many people know about, but I think he's somebody to definitely draw inspiration from. I want to ask a couple of audience questions. They posted some questions for you. How much of this book was based on historical research, like A Brief History of Seven Killings?
It was based on a lot of research. I wouldn't call it historical research. A lot of it was archaeological research. A lot of it was anthropological research. And even that's kind of tricky. Like I said, you know, if it's a history book written about Africa anywhere older than say the 70s, I usually just read it just for comedy purposes. Especially if it was written by a European, they're essentially useless. Yeah, so what I found is how do I put this? If you're gonna there was a lot of historical research, just not in the way in which we used to. If you're gonna look for a big book that tells you something and follow what is still a very Eurocentric idea that these big books are authorities just because they're big and because they're books, then you're not gonna learn much. If you break that tradition, and people have finally started to do it, where they start to realize oral narratives are legit.
Absolutely.
And oral histories are as legit as any written history. You're like, well, oral histories may contain biases. Really, and written histories don't.
They're also hugely prevalent, I think, in Black cultures. Like, you know, however far back you go, certainly that was a big part of my growing up in Nigeria. Was like, in fact, that was my first experience of storytelling, as oral storytelling. You know, and you kind of carried those stories with you. We talked earlier about how they mutate depending on who's telling them, which I also love. Like, there's a magic in that. Yeah.
So you realize, because I think we also have this idea, I'm telling you, the amount of unlearning I had to do to write this book, we have this idea of truth. You know, you hear things like the authentic version or the director's cut and things like that. And whereas I can tell you an Anansi story, the same story every day for the week, and I change something. They're all true.
Yeah.
Even though there are 5 different versions of it.
Yeah. Also, which version are you going to remember? Which version is your memory going to remember? And also your memory can play tricks on you as well, I think.
And the question is it a trick? Is truth to a huge extent how you choose to interpret something? It's you know, the thing, it blows my mind, the sophistication of people who only used to listen to stories. Because, you know, the burden of truth is no longer on the storyteller. The burden of truth is on the listener. You have to listen and figure it out, which makes me think we keep thinking oral societies are kind of primitive. I'm like, no, they could juggle 7 stories and figure it out without reading a single word.
Absolutely. Hugely sophisticated, I think. And it's very much underestimated.
It's like, it's great that you have sophisticated hands and, you know, but they had sophisticated ears. And the ways, this is what, I mean, I had a whole, this was almost very important for me that this novel feels like it should be read aloud.
Brilliant.
Because a lot of stuff I learned was transcriptions of oral histories. And taking those seriously, like, no, this is mythology. Like, no, this is history. If I were to do a story, to come back to Britain, if I were to write a history of Britain from the point of view of the early British, it would be nothing like what we read now. And yet it's true. It's true for them.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that's the thing, is what is truth for this kind of story and this kind of world and these kind of people.
Right,
And that's what I wrote.
absolutely. Brilliant. Another question that's come through is, in a brief history, there were so many narrators. Was that hard to keep track of while you were writing it?
Oh, totally. That's why I had a chart on the wall. And I had a notebook.
So you had a chart that you followed and would go back to?
I had to, because what I didn't want to start doing was play favorites. And I think that's very easy to do when you're not keeping track and making sure every character, you know, gets their screen time, for want of a better word. But yeah, it was a lot of checking and double checking, a lot of trusting that my subconscious was a better writer. I was talking to Tana French, the crime novelist, few days ago, and we're both talking about that moment when you come across in your book where you wonder how you're going to tie all this together, what you're going to do, and then you read it, you reread your manuscript and realize, oh, you had this plot in place 4 pages ago or 200 pages ago. And it just ties together. And I think it's trusting. It's to me, I call it trusting your subconscious to be a better writer than you.
It's trusting yourself, really. It's trusting that you have what you need in you to tell the story, I guess. And if you've done it before, it's like having a certain memory. You can conjure that feeling back and then just sort of follow it, right?
Yeah, but I think it's fine if it doesn't all add up. And I think that's the other thing. I think we're a little too concerned with tying everything together, and life doesn't work that way. Yeah.
Another question that's come through is, what were your influences for writing this book? I mean, we've talked about Tolkien, we've talked about George R.R. Martin. I got shades of Chinua Achebe as well.
But more Amos Tutuola.
Oh, perfect! I love him. He's amazing.
And a writer that I think Nigerians know a lot, and Nigerians know, but most people don't know. His name is, I think it's D.O. Faguna, and he wrote one of the first novels written in Yoruba. And the English, there are lots of translations. How would I translate it in English?
What's the name of the book, Marlon?
That's the thing. I'm trying to remember what would be a good English translation. I think like Forest of 1,000 Demons.
Okay.
I'm trying to figure out an accurate translation.
Well, if people Google the name, hopefully it will come up.
Yeah, it's yeah. What is it? I'm trying to remember what is the novel called, because Wole Soyinka did a recent translation in English. And it is what it is. It's mostly oral tradition. Oh yeah, it's called Forest of 1,000 Demons by D.O. Fagunwa.
Brilliant.
And that was a huge influence on me, because, and it's funny because that novel, it's powerful, but it's interesting how Christian that novel is, which I wasn't necessarily, that part I wasn't very interested in. But I was interested that here's a novel that was fully into the spirit world, and treated as real. Another novel that was a big influence on me is my friend Ben's novel, The Famished Road. Ben Okrie's novel, The Famished Road.
Right. Yeah.
That was a huge influence. All the, again, a lot of the influences, if I'm right, a story like this, of course, a lot of my influences aren't books.
Well, I was going to come to that and ask you, because there are filmic references in this, there are comic book references in this, musical references in there. I mean, it's chocked so much with so much. Could you mention a couple of those before?
Sure, like I'm hugely inspired by X-Men comics. I mean, in a lot of ways, this is a story of a superhero team. And I still write in I still write in a way where you can tell I read a lot of Marvel comics. Music in the sense, not in the sense that music in the sense that I tried to be musical, but music in the sense that I am very inspired by how other artists create. And having like the right painting in my office can do more for me than reading 1,000 books that are in a style that I'm going to write. And music, particularly jazz, particularly 70s jazz, particularly like Herbie Hancock, Miles Davis, Benny Maupin. There's something about that kind of, it's easy to say improvisation, but it's something about being so creatively free all the time while I'm hearing it that inspires me.
Yeah, absolutely.
Inspires me to do that, inspires me to do that, as well. But you're right about, Achebe, Faguna, Tutuola, Bessie Head. Who else was I reading? I like to read who my heroes read. So the second Toni Morrison said Bessie Head, I had to read
You
Where
need
Rain
to
Clouds Gather.
discover her work. Yeah, Bessie is also a great short story writer. I think a lot of people don't know about her work. Again, African woman writer. I mean, there's so much in that history to draw from. I think that people aren't really aware of. So the wonderful thing about reading a book like this is talking to you about those references and getting them for people and sort of collating them so people can also go and discover those writers. You talked about the right sort of painting. I'm similar in terms of going to see exhibitions. Like, a certain image can do so much for me and just send me off in terms of being creative and, actually creating a context around that, creating a world around it. It just does so much for you. I could talk to you all night. I mean, it's such a fascinating conversation. Quickly before you go, I know that you're starting a new literary podcast, which is exciting. So tell us about that, a little bit about that, and also what you're doing next.
Well, it's already started actually. We already did our own, I think 7 or 9 episodes, I can't remember. And it's called Marlon and Jake Read Dead People. And it happened because
that's a great title.
Huh?
That's a great title.
So it happened because me and my editor, Jake Morrissey, always get into arguments about books, usually about dead authors. Right. And people would pass us by in the office and go, "You two should take that on the road."
So now you have.
Until somebody finally said, "You two should have a show. We have a studio downstairs." And that's how it began. And it really is a continuation of, of the kind of conversations we have. And the thing is, I've known him for years and he edits all my books, but we still surprise each other. So we talk a lot about books from old people that people aren't, not old people, dead people, people long gone, what we have that are, underrated, a lot that are overrated. We get into fights about everybody. He likes Trollop, I don't. I remember one episode where we're talking about books turned into films. And he was very surprised at what I said is the greatest film ever based off a book.
Right. I guess we have to listen to is that on the podcast?
It's on the podcast.
Oh, great. Okay. Well, that's a nice cliffhanger, I guess, to kind of to leave it on. We'll have to check out the podcast to find out more about those conversations. But I love that you and your editor have that kind of relationship where, you really get into the meat and bones of discussions around books and hopefully, I guess, spark some interesting dialogue around that. So that's definitely one to check out. And are you working on the next installment of this, because it's a trilogy, isn't it?
I'm working on a sequel to Black Leopard, Red Wolf. It's called Moon Witch, Spider King, and it's sequel is a weird way of describing it because it's not a sequel. It doesn't pick up where Black Leopard left off. It's a different character telling the same story over, and the character who's telling this story was in a lot of ways was sort of the antagonist, one of the antagonists and villains of the first story. So her story is going to be totally different.
Right.
And I also people, there are characters in the book who a lot of people have read how much they felt fallen for them and how much they love these characters. And I'm like, man, you're probably going to regret that.
Something's going to happen.
Yeah, because this character who's telling the story has issues. She's also, the sequel. The one thing I'll give away, I don't want to give it too much, is that the sequel begins 177 years before Black Leopard, Red Wolf.
Oh, wow. Okay. So it's almost like a prequel, really.
It's almost like a prequel,
Yeah.
actually.
Okay. Okay, cool. That's really exciting. I mean, you're constantly pushing yourself in new and exciting ways. I think that's what makes you such a dynamic writer. Thank you so much, Marlon, for a fantastic, fascinating conversation. We really appreciate you taking the time to spend some time with us this evening. It's been an absolute joy. I could talk to you for another 2 hours, just kind of picking your brain about stuff and mining all your references, because they're all incredible. But thank you so much. I'm going to hand over to the WowE team.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's a pleasure.
All right. Well, first off, thank you very, very much, Irenosen, for all of your preparation for agreeing to do this. A fantastic host, and really guided that conversation. Marlon, for being first agreeing to come, but being so generous in terms of your time and talking about your work and your writing. I'm blown away, really. There is so much to kind of take from there. The podcast, as you said, that's something to follow up. And to chase down your work, to get your novel Black Leopard, Red Wolf. I'd also say our amazing host, who's a prize winner herself just recently, I'd say to check out your work as well, because that sounds fascinating, and I hope everybody takes away from this some stuff in terms of fiction that you talked about, but also the writing process, which I thought was absolutely fascinating. So thank you to you both. You've really made an absolutely top event, bang right in the middle of our Black History Month events for us. It's been brilliant. It really, really has. So thank you to you. I'd like to thank, obviously, everybody for tuning in, for our audience. I'd also like to thank our funders, the Mayor City Fund, Culture Liverpool, Arts Council England, for their support as well. You're going to see on Facebook, you'll see in the comments box a monitoring form. We'd really appreciate if you'd fill that in. It gives us great feedback for us to be able to shape our events for the future. And also, this event was free. If you'd like to make a donation, we'd really appreciate that too. And I'd like to thank all of the Writing on the Wall staff for their support and the work that they've done in putting this together. We have a whole series of Black History Month events taking place at the moment, coming up in the next couple of weeks. As Madeline said, Black History Month falls on a very, very important year, and vital that we listen to the writers, to the artists, engage in the debates and the discussions that we are putting forward for you. Tomorrow night we've got Emi Onyora at 7 o'clock in partnership with Hope University's Black History Month events. He'll be talking about the 1919 race riots, particularly around a book that he co-authored with my co-director Madeleine Hennigan on the 1919 race riots. So tune into that. On Friday, we have at 11 o'clock story time with Cheryl Martin. And next week, we have a whole series of events, Rewriting History with Madeleine Hennigan, also community historian Lawrence Westgaff, Sonia Bassi, the chair of Mandela 8, and Emi Onyora, again, co-author of Great Water Race Riots, and community activist Stephen Enzi. On Wednesday, we have story time with the writer Patience Agbabi. And on Thursday, we have Public Crisis Then and Now with Stephen Small. On Friday, we have another story time, a superhero story time this time with Nathan Powell. We also have a series of events the following week. If you go onto our website, wowfest.uk, you'll find all the events there. And to find out a little bit more about Writing on the Wall, if you go on to writingonthewall.org.uk, you'll see all about our work, which is Black History Month, our annual festival, and also a whole series of projects that we run as well. Once again, thanks to Irenosen and thanks to Marlon. I think it's been absolutely fantastic. And we look forward to read more of Marlon's work, the sequel that's coming up, and hopefully we'll have him back at WowFest and Black History Month again, maybe next year. If it's finished, maybe the year after, we'll see. Thank you once again, and good night.